what will happen is that these heads, you will start to see this dusting that comes on them, which is actually the pollen. And this pollen will then go on to fertilize the wheat grain. And once it has been fertilized, these flowers then start to set seed. And as they set seed, the plant will keep on growing, and it will get to a point where it starts to die. And at this point where it starts to die, it starts to change into this golden brown kind of color. Hi, welcome to We Sow, and in today's episode I'm going to talk to you about the process of growing wheat. And this episode specifically forms part of our mini-series which we have entitled From Grain to Loaf. And this mini-series is one where we are talking about wheat, but also the process of growing wheat and ultimately making a loaf of bread. However, if you stick around and stay tuned for this episode, I'll be going through how we sowed the wheat, how we cultivated the wheat, and finally the harvest. So let's begin. The variety of wheat which we grow on this allotment plot is known as Paragon, and this variety is a spring sown wheat, which means that you can sow it in the spring and still get a harvest in the summer. And this is different to winter sown wheat, which only has to be sown in the winter or else it will not flower, because winter wheat needs a cold snap in order for the flowers to be able to be activated and then grow into grain. But fortunately, when you grow spring wheat, it can be sown in spring as well as in winter. Now the first step of growing wheat which we followed was the preparation of the bed. And specifically what we had to do was dig out the bed, and we made sure that we tried to dig out the bed so that the soil would be nice and loose, and we made use of different tools to dig it out, including a push hoe, which helped to add to the effect of digging out with the normal fork. And the good thing about the push hoe was that it was useful with extra attachments, and the extra attachments that we had included an attachment for digging out the trenches, specifically a plough-like attachment. And so this made digging out the trenches quite easy to do, or should I say quite efficient to do. It's not totally easy, but easier than doing it using other tools. And so we were able to space out our rows nicely using the push hoe. And then the next step was that we had to sow the wheat into the actual trenches, and we had a seed disperser which we were able to fill with the wheat berries and shake those into the actual trenches. And then once the wheat berries have been sown in, it's just a simple case of taking a rake and raking over the soil so that it covers up those seeds. And then the final step with that was just to water really well. And in the case of this process, once you have done all of this, there isn't too much to do apart from just waiting. In fact, you don't need to even necessarily water that much after you've watered the first time. Once the wheat has been sown, the important thing to keep an eye out for is the weeding. And this is because weeds can compete for light and space with your grain. And at the beginning of the process, as the wheat is growing and starting to come up, you will notice that there will be some weeds that start to emerge, and as they start to take hold, you want to make sure that you weed out those trenches. And the trenches can be weeded out. In our case, we used a push hoe in order to do this, and that was important at the beginning of the growing portion of the process. However, as the wheat starts to pick up more size as the season goes on, you will have to do this again, maybe at least another 2 more times. And it's just a simple case of using something such as a push hoe to go through each of the trenches. And with ours, our push hoe had a flat end which could be attached on, and we just had to run it through the trenches, or should I say through the gaps between each of the rows. and that would cut through the weeds, and then they could be removed. And the good thing as well about using the push hoe is the fact that it can be used quite effectively, providing that the soil isn't too dry but also not too wet, and it will do its job without too much difficulty. The process of cultivating the wheat isn't too difficult. In fact, wheat for the most part can take care of itself. I hardly watered it, as it's not really that necessary since it's quite a hardy plant to grow. The main thing was just to keep an eye on the stages of growth that the wheat was actually going through. What you will notice with the wheat is that it goes through different stages of growth, as it begins by looking like just simple grass, no different to regular grass. Then it starts to pick up a bit more size, it starts to get a bit taller, and at this stage it's nice and green. And then the interesting part is where you start to see how over the weeks it just gets higher and higher, and then the point where the flowers are to emerge, they start to emerge on the middle of the actual grain. And as the grain gets taller, you will just see these heads start to emerge and come through the middle of the plant. And then what will happen is that these heads, you will start to see this dusting that comes on them, which is actually the pollen. And this pollen will then go on to fertilize the wheat grain. And once it has been fertilized, these flowers then start to set seed. And as they set seed, the plant will keep on growing, and it will get to a point where it starts to die. And at this point where it starts to die, it starts to change into this golden brown kind of color. And it's once it's at its full color of golden brown, and you can tell that the wheat grain is completely dead, or should I say the wheat plant is completely dead, that's the point at which you are ready to harvest. In the case of the harvesting process, the one major requirement is a tool in order to do the harvest. And the tool specifically is a sickle. And the sickle is useful because what you would do with it is that you would go to the plant along each row, and you hold the sickle at the base of the plant, and you hold the top of the wheat, and you pull with the sickle so that it slices the base of the wheat grain plant. And you would do this by working from each row, or should I say working from the end of each row to the other end, gathering up the wheat as you go. And then it's just a simple case of placing what has been gathered up into a suitable bag, or in my case I've got a rubble bag because of the quantities of wheat that we are growing. Once the wheat has been harvested, the next and important step is what is known as threshing. And threshing is the process of separating the grain from its heads. And this is important because when you look at the anatomy of a wheat plant, you'll find that on the top of the stalk you have the heads, and then the heads have these husks, and inside the husks are the grains. And in order for us to get the grains out, we need to have a process that can separate them quickly. Now in the past we've used a blender to do it, set on the lowest setting. Now this is great for smaller quantities, whereby maybe you could grow a loaf of bread. However, at scale we find this process a bit laborious, and the machine tends to overheat and it can take hours to do. So simply what we have done is we have sourced a threshing machine, and this machine is foot powered, and what it does is it just allows us to press down on the lever, or should I say the pedal, and as the pedal goes up and down, it has a crank which spins, and it causes a drum on the middle to start spinning. And as it starts to pick up speed, you can then just hold the grain in bundles onto this drum, and the force of the actual drum spinning causes the heads to break up and come out the other end. And the beauty with common wheat, which we are growing, is that it's naked wheat. So unlike some of the older varieties of wheat, or even some of the just other varieties whereby they are completely hulled. When you thresh, the grain actually comes out separated from its husk, rather than the husk being permanent, not permanently, but being attached to the grain. In the case of, I believe, the hulled wheats, such as some of the older varieties, and also things like spelt, for example, um, you, I believe, have to go through an extra step to remove this husk, and it's very laborious, and this is why it tends to cost more. However, in our case, now that we're just growing common wheat, we just simply have to use the threshing machine by pedaling on the pedal to spin the drum, and then out comes the other end, the grain separated from its chaff, or should I say actually mixed in with its chaff. And so that is the portion whereby we thresh, just to get the heads broken up. Now, the step that follows this threshing process is what we call winnowing. And winnowing is whereby we need to completely separate the chaff, or the broken up husk, away from the grain. And the way to do it is to make use of wind. Now, in the past, people would just use buckets, and they would wait for a windy day to hold the buckets full of the grain and trash and drop it from one bucket into another bucket, and then the wind would blow away the lighter chaff away from the wheat, as the grains then just fall into the bucket. However, what we've done is we purchased a dust blower, and it's just a case of us filling a bucket and blowing with the dust blower as the chaff will separate from the wheat. But also, one way which we typically have used it is to pour the grain from one bucket to another, but rather than relying on actual wind from a windy day, we use the wind from the dust blower. So I would hold the dust blower as it's blowing air, and as I'm tipping my wheat from one bucket to another, and that dust blower will push away the lighter chaff as the grain falls into the bucket. And you keep on doing this until eventually you have a clean collection of grain. One area where the Vitamix is still useful in the process of threshing is where some of the heads broke off of the stalks before actually being run through the threshing machine. So it's useful sometimes to just gather those up and run them through the Vitamix. Also, in some instances as well, just to refine the cleaning. So after the threshing has been done, you can gather up what has been collected. Once you've kind of started the winnowing process, if there are still just a few bits that need a little bit more thorough cleaning, you can just run them through the Vitamix 1 or 2 times. And so overall, the process is a lot better than having to try and do the entire process using the Vitamix, which takes a lot longer. And the final stage after we have threshed the wheat and winnowed the wheat is storage. And the way we personally store the wheat berries is we use these bags which we purchased, or should I say, which we received when we purchased the first batch of wheat originally from an organic producer. And the bags which we managed to get hold about 25 kilos. And so once we have our grain which is clean, we place it in these bags. And we also have drums, which, or should I say, we have a drum which we store in our garage, and we place the bag inside of the drum, and then it's just a case of sealing up the drum. And once it's in the garage, the condition and the temperatures will keep that grain nice and preserved, so that we can retrieve it whenever we want to bake in our home.
Thanks for watching. Please remember to like, comment, subscribe and share. It's raining, my hair's getting wet, I've got to go, bye!
And she's gone.